Well, it's a terrible figure, isn't it, of loss of life? And I think the worrying thing is, I don't think it means anything at all to Vladimir Putin. Putin has staked his reputation, his legacy on trying to get to something he can call a victory in Ukraine. And the loss of human life is irrelevant to him, I think. And I think he's persuaded that he can go on keeping such a tight clampdown on Russian domestic opinion that the casualties won't affect his regime or the stability of his hold on power.
Hello and welcome to Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now, today we're talking to Lord Peter Ricketts. Lord Ricketts has had a stellar career and is a former British ambassador to France between 2012 and 2016, also non-residential ambassador to Monaco many moons ago, and is also the British government's first national security advisor and permanent undersecretary at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, the head of the diplomatic service. And you've got experience in Southeast Asia as well. Lord Ricketts, Peter, welcome back to Frontline.
Good to be with you again.
Yeah. Now, this week we have hit a milestone. In fact, it's yesterday we hit a milestone, according to the Ukrainian Minister of Defence, backed up by UK Defence Intelligence today. And that milestone is not a good one. It's 1 million Russian casualties, and that's dead or wounded. And given the shockingly bad medical support that the Russians have got, most of their severely wounded are likely to die. In reality, how significant do you think this milestone is for A, Vladimir Putin, and B, Donald Trump, who keeps talking about the waste of life that there is in conflict?
Well, it's a terrible figure, isn't it, of loss of life? And I think the worrying thing is, I don't think it means anything at all to Vladimir Putin. Putin has staked his reputation, his legacy, on trying to get to something he can call a victory in Ukraine. And the loss of human life is irrelevant to him, I think. And I think he's persuaded that he can go on keeping such a tight clampdown on Russian domestic opinion that the casualties won't affect his regime or the stability of his hold on power. Terrible thing to say. Donald Trump, of course, is right about the loss of life, but he's wrong to see each side as equally to blame, or sometimes Zelensky is more to blame for this war. So he hasn't converted his perfectly good humanitarian instinct to stop the loss of life into clarity that means getting Putin to the table and forcing him to accept a settlement which allows Ukraine to live in peace in the future. And that seems to be a step he can't take.
Yeah. And of course, the casualty figures are purely Russian casualties. It doesn't include the Ukrainians, and they will have a significant number themselves, possibly upwards of 500,000 or maybe more dead and wounded. This makes the conflict in Europe as one of the most bloody conflicts that we've seen in recent years, does it not?
Oh, yes. I mean, the most bloody and the most devastating and the most destructive since the Second World War. I mean, there hasn't been industrial warfare on this scale since 1945. And of course, the Ukrainians got a smaller population. And therefore, I think Putin feels he can grind down Ukraine, especially if he can distract Donald Trump off into doing bilateral deals with Russia. He doesn't calculate us Europeans have the stamina and the staying power to support Ukraine in the long term, and that in the end, therefore, he can grind out some kind of victory. I mean, it's our job to make sure he can't do that. But yes, the Ukrainian people have suffered terribly, and this is a generational shock to people in Ukraine.
So where do you think this leaves us with any hope for a ceasefire and any start to negotiations for a potential end of the war? We've had two meetings of the Russians and the Ukrainians sitting down that seem to have only resulted in agreement for some prisoner swaps and some body exchanges. At least both sides are talking, which is a positive thing, but there doesn't seem to be an appetite for more talks coming through at the moment. And Donald Trump has uncharacteristically remained pretty quiet.
Well, yeah, I think it's a dialogue of the deaf going on between the Russians and the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians genuinely want a ceasefire. The Russians don't, I don't think. I think Putin doesn't see it as in his interest now. He feels his troops are moving forward and that he can keep on grinding down the Ukrainians. So that is not going to lead anywhere if it's left just to the two sides. Trump, with his great vaunting of being able to do a deal in a day or in 6 weeks, has found that is all much more difficult. And since he doesn't seem to be prepared to put the real compelling pressure on Putin to come to the table, he is backing out and dialing down American engagement, certainly politically. Obviously, the very worrying thing would be if he also dialed it down in terms of military support, intelligence support to Ukraine. As far as I know, that is still continuing, but on a declining scale. And I think the figures in the recently released from the Pentagon show there's a declining trend in American military support to Ukraine, which is not unexpected, but puts even more weight on the European shoulders. So, no, I think left to themselves, the Russians and Ukrainians are not going to come to a peace deal because Putin doesn't want one.
Well, I'll come on to that declining support in a moment, but before we get to there, in that horrific, from a diplomatic perspective, meeting in the Oval Office where Zelensky was ambushed by J.D. Vance, and then that ambush was followed through by Donald Trump. Donald Trump started talking about cards and card games and saying Zelensky didn't have any cards to play. But we've seen Operation Spider's Web, that very audacious attack using drones flying out of the back of modified trucks in parts of Russia, attacking Russia's strategic bomber fleet. We've seen the same help derail a train carrying lots of Russian equipment. We've seen attacks against Russian rail infrastructure, against command and control. We've seen attacks against Russian generals inside Moscow, and almost daily attacks against Russian defense manufacturing infrastructure. It seems to be that Zelensky is playing lots of cards and pulling lots of aces out of different places. How surprised do you think, A, Vladimir Putin is, and B, Donald Trump is with all of this? Because he wasn't really expecting it.
Well, I think Donald Trump underestimated the staying power and the resilience of the Ukrainians, and he's absolutely got that wrong. And the Ukrainians are capable of surprising us continually. I mean, they have been extraordinarily good. This sort of, how shall I say, this sort of asymmetric attack, which has taken months, if not a year or more to plan, clearly caught the Russians by surprise, showed them that the Ukrainians have capacities that they didn't expect, have put them on the back foot. And if you couple that with the extraordinary drone production that the Ukrainians seem to be keeping up out of garages and back gardens month by month, they have shown an enormous creativity and adaptability, which I think has caught the Russians by surprise. Of course, the Russians are also learning from that and are also making more use of these sorts of drones and AI in their equipment. I think they've come on by leaps and bounds as well. That's the problem with warfare. It accelerates innovation. And the Ukrainians have shown themselves very good at that, but it demonstrates to Trump that he was completely wrong in his assessment of Zelensky and the staying power of the Ukrainian people. He hasn't translated that into wholehearted support for the Ukrainian government.
Yeah, the innovation that's coming out of the Ukrainian SBU, their security services, and their HUR, their military intelligence, is phenomenal. But the UK Strategic Defence Review, I didn't see much in that about UK developing its own asymmetric warfare capability for the modern battlefield. Surely that's one big lesson that we've got out of Ukraine, that we need to do that. Get back to what we used to be good at in the Second World War, our good old special operations executive type activity.
Yeah, I think there is quite a lot in the Defence Review about a more adaptable, creative, flexible, fast responding industrial base involving more small and medium-sized companies, more startups, more civilian tech experts rather than the big, heavy, slow-moving defence conglomerates. So I think that's in there. I think the actual operational side of things, I mean, we do have a very effective special forces. They're never talked about very much. But I think the capacity to produce large numbers of simple but effective weapons at low cost very quickly and adapt them as the battlefield changes is not something we got built into our industrial base. And I think George Robertson and his experts have been quite careful to say that that is something essential. You don't just spend the money on hugely expensive submarines and aeroplanes, but on that sort of fleet of foot, backyard manufacturing capability. It's never going to be easy to do that in peacetime. The Ukrainians are in a wartime economy. We are not. But there are many, many lessons, and I do believe that the Ministry of Defence are really trying to learn the lessons.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. In my 26 years in the military, there are military commanders used to encourage thinking outside the box. But then anytime we got people who did think outside the box, they didn't like it because it didn't fit into the doctrinal norms of what they wanted to do. And they would stifle that thinking very quickly indeed. But, it's the one thing I think in the modern battle space we need to actively encourage. And yes, there were some good words in this Strategic Defence Review, wrapped up in an awful lot of language that wasn't exact and telling the government to do things. It was giving the government ideas, but ways out of funding those ideas.
Well, I'm not sure that's quite fair. I mean, this was an external review by George Robertson and a couple of non-government people, and they submitted it to the government. And what the government have done effectively is said, yes, we accept these recommendations. Keir Starmer has also said that he will find the funding necessary.
Mm-hmm.
But your central point is right. I mean, I think the strategy is a very good strategy. I think strategies work if they set priorities and make choices and don't just promise to do everything. The problem is the money isn't there to deliver it.
Yeah.
And we can all understand why that's incredibly difficult after the very tough spending round we have just had. But all we're committed to is getting to 2.5% of GDP by 2027, and beyond that, nothing is clear. And Keir Starmer, as you know, is going to a NATO summit in The Hague in about 10 days' time, where everyone is going to be sitting with a draft declaration saying 3.5% of GDP on hard defence and another 1.5% on the infrastructure and the intelligence that makes the military operation work. And Keir Starmer is going to have an answer to that. Mm-hmm. I don't think he can just sign off saying, I promise I'm going to deliver that, because he hasn't got his chancellor there. But there is going to have to be some commitment in a reasonably defined timescale to get to 3.5% of spending on defence. And that is a massive, massive increase. But if he's serious that the world has changed and we are now under much greater threat, somehow or other he's got to do that, as have other allied leaders as well.
Yeah, well, Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, on Monday at Chatham House was very, very clear. He effectively turned around and said, I expect allied leaders will agree to spend 5% of GDP on defence. It will be a NATO-wide commitment and a defining moment for the alliance. He then went on to, and I'm paraphrasing him here, say that if we didn't do that, we may as well start to learn Russian. Of course, the United States only spend 3.17% of GDP on defence, and that's split between NATO, the North Atlantic, their commitments there, and the Pacific. It's just their GDP is so huge, the numbers are eye-watering, and there's no call from them for saying that they're going to spend 5%, and we've got other NATO nations not even achieving the 2% target at the moment, which is the current requirement, and they include significant countries such as Canada, a Five Eyes member, but Italy, who seem to produce an awful lot of bang for their bucks and not spending so much money, but the likes of Spain and others. Do you think that NATO is going to be able to get nations to sign up to this? And it's great signing up to it, but to deliver capability that will add up to either 3.5% or 5% if you include all this new stuff that Mark Rutte was talking about on defence budgets?
Well, that's a big question, but let's unpack it a little bit. First of all, I think Mark Rutte has been quite clever. He knows that Trump wants the figure of 5% in the NATO declaration. I've heard tell that he won't even come unless that is agreed by allied leaders in advance. But he knows that no NATO ally is going to get to 5% of defence spending, 5% of GDP on defence. So he's come up with this 3.5% on real hard defence and 1.5% actually of money that countries are spending anyway on the infrastructure, the kind of roads and railways, getting military to the ports, the intelligence support, cyber support. Most countries can probably find that they're spending 1.5% of GDP on relevant things to military readiness. And then the 3.5%, well, yes, I think people will have to sign up to it. I mean, Donald Trump is going to be sitting there listening. No, I don't think anyone's going to get to it anytime soon. And that disparity between what people are going to come away from The Hague committed to and what they're actually going to do is going to be a difficulty for politicians all around Europe, including Keir Starmer, who has not prepared his party, as far as I can see, or Parliament, for having to come back and explain why he signed up to a figure of 3.5%, which isn't anywhere in the spending review or in the kind of, I have an ambition to get to 3% by some point in the next Parliament. But I think he won't be the only politician who's going to have to come back and do some explaining there. But I think everyone will judge that it's worth it to keep Donald Trump on board in NATO, that huge American military capacity, rather than say, well, I refuse to come and I'll have to think again about the US commitment to NATO at all. It's worth doing a little bit of, shall we say, clever accounting and at least promising to do better in the future, while still hopefully developing large amounts of cash, as the British government is doing, to be fair to them, in the short term, to really get on with a big ramp up in defence industrial capacity.
Yeah, well, if I was Keir Starmer listening to this, or John Healey, I'd be turning around and saying at the NATO summit, yes, we can sign up to 3.5% whenever the conditions allow, knowing perfectly well that Donald Trump will not be president by then, and we have to see who is, because it'll take quite a while to get there beyond the next Parliament. But you talked about the upcoming NATO summit. I've seen a piece come out from Bloomberg that turned around and says NATO is going to, in its official statement, continue to recognise Russia as a threat, but not actually formally articulate them as the aggressor in Ukraine. I wonder if that's a sop to Donald Trump, but it signals for the first time that Russia's war in Ukraine is not going to be the primary focus, certainly in the public debate that's going on at the summit. This is taking part, of course, on the 24th and 25th of June at The Hague, I believe. What do you think, Putin will make of this? And do you think this mealy-mouthing of the threat and all the rest of it is down to Donald Trump's influence?
Well, I think two things are happening. One is NATO summit declarations are basically prepared in advance, and leaders don't spend any time at the table sitting there arguing over them. I was an ambassador in NATO in the time myself, and I know this. So the declaration
It's your fault.
Yeah, it's all my fault. The declaration is tailored to allow Trump to agree to it without a great row and a rumpus. Yeah. So, I mean, if this leaked draft is true, they are eliding the fact that Russia is the aggressor in Ukraine, while still saying it's a threat to NATO. And if that's the price of getting Donald Trump agreement and keeping Donald Trump and the Americans foursquare within NATO, then I think the judgment is that that's a diplomatic price worth paying. The real discussion, is not about the declaration. It'll be around the table about what is really going on in Ukraine. And I hope there that Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron, Friedrich Merz, the new German Chancellor, who is a pretty hard line on Ukraine, will talk much more toughly to Trump, having got the declaration out of the way, about the need for him to stay the course supporting Ukraine. I do think, though, it's becoming increasingly clear that what Trump is trying to do is disconnect the issue of the war in Ukraine from his bilateral relationships with Putin. So distance himself from Ukraine, leave that problem basically to the Europeans, and get on and do business deals, arms control deals with Putin and the Russians separately. That's very bad news for Ukraine, of course. It's very bad news for European security. But that seems to me to be the way his thinking is going. And the way that declaration has been drafted looks to me like rather confirmation of that. The two things are being handled in separate boxes, if you like.
Yeah. The other thing that people seem to be questioning is the veracity of Article 5. Of course, Article 5 is the part of the NATO agreement where an attack on one is considered an attack on all. And that is part of the wider deterrent. We heard from the head of German intelligence this week that he's fully expecting the Russians to test the resolve of Article 5 at some stage soon. But given what we're seeing from Donald Trump and the Americans, and yes, they're saying they're still in NATO, but the levels of support that are in there, and during his first presidency, he said, if you don't pay, I don't play, which is effectively undermining it. Do you think Article 5 is now really just a paper tiger?
Oh, gosh. I mean, no, I don't think we should work on that assumption. I mean, first of all, Trump has asked for us to pay, and we are paying. I mean, the way European defence spending has risen since 2016 when he came into power, it's at least doubled, I think, across the alliance. So we are paying. And I mean, nobody has ever been able to say for absolutely sure that for any given Soviet or Russian move, the Americans would respond with all-out war against Russia. I mean, there's always been a degree of ambiguity there, and that's partly the deterrent effect of Article 5. No, nobody can be absolutely sure that he would. Equally, the Russians can't work on the assumption that he wouldn't come to the support of a NATO ally. So that's the deterrence effect of Article 5. And the only time Article 5 has been invoked, as you know, was for the Americans at the time of 9/11. When other allies, including the UK, invoked it on behalf of America. Otherwise, it's never been tested. So, no, nobody can be sure how Trump would react in the kind of extreme crisis that would be involved in a NATO attack on a member of NATO. But you certainly couldn't rule out that he would suddenly see there that he owes something to his generational allies in the west of Europe. So that deterrence and that ambiguity, at least I think is maintained.
Yeah, well, strategic ambiguity is a tactical by itself, and I think that's at the heart of what NATO does. It certainly is the heart of our nuclear deterrent from a strategic perspective, keeping people guessing, which is why people were so concerned about potential prime ministers coming in who had very strong views on nuclear deterrent. But luckily, that was never tested.
You're right. And there's been one, if I may just interject one thing, there was a very odd story, a story that I found curious in the Times a week or two ago, that there's some consideration to Britain taking on another strategic nuclear deterrent system. Talking about going to what other NATO countries have, which is American bombs stored on their territory, delivered by their own aircraft as a way of sharing the nuclear burden. I mean, I found that very odd to be in discussion in London, since we have our strategic deterrent. There's no need for us to burden share. And the idea that we would be flying manned aircraft with American bombs hung underneath them to drop them on the target in a kind of Second World War style in the 21st century, given the air defenses that are around, doesn't seem to me to be a very credible deterrent. So I was surprised by that story. I didn't really find it in the SDR itself. It's clearly been discussed in the corridors of Whitehall. Personally, I think it's a lousy idea.
Well, I think in the SDR, it was 2 and 2 plus 7, because there was talk of the F-35A being brought in alongside the F-35B, the B being the vertical takeoff carrier version, the A needing a runway. But all of the A's that come out are nuclear capable. They can drop the US nuclear bomb. And then that started a debate I think amongst the uninformed of UK potentially using US tactical nuclear devices. But from my perspective,
I think it's a lousy idea.
Yeah, well, from my perspective, I don't think there's any such thing as a tactical nuclear device. That's used for arms control purposes. If you use a nuclear device, it has got a strategic impact, even if it's just one.
You're absolutely right. We have not had any use of nuclear weapons since 1945. One use of however small a nuclear weapon is a massive strategic event. And the UK has got the capacity to deter with nuclear weapons. We certainly don't need to go back to another one which has the flavor of the 1960s and the 1970s in a world where everything has changed in terms of air defense.
Well, in the 60s, 70s, I'm a Cold War BAOR soldier, so British Army of the Rhine soldier. And every major exercise that we had always finished in a chemical attack by the Russians on our positions. And then our response was tactical nuclear exchange to destroy massive Russian forces. And that's where all of this seems to have come from. And people forget we've moved on from then. But every exercise finished with nuclear exchange, which was not a good thing. And most people in the public, thank goodness, are not aware of that. But do you think it's this misunderstanding, which is why commentators are turning around and every time Vladimir Putin rattles the nuclear saber, start to suggest that, he could use a tactical nuclear weapon. This will be him sending intent. The reality is he knows it'll have a strategic effect, and there's no way would he ever do it.
Well, I mean, I think what you say illustrates a really important point, which is that the current generation, anybody under about 40 or 45, has never had to think about nuclear weapons. And the last time people really thought about them was when the Americans were deploying the cruise missiles at Greenham Common and elsewhere in the 1980s, which led to large-scale public protests. Since then, I think everyone's forgotten about nuclear weapons, basically. And the concept of nuclear deterrence, which is such a mind-bending thought, that you have to have these colossal weapons that, if they were used, would probably be the end of humanity. You have them not to use them, but in order to deter the other side from using them. I mean, we were used to thinking in those terms in the Cold War. I think that's completely gone out of people's way of thinking about the world. And part of the reason that we've got this defense review is to get people thinking again that, although I don't think anybody thinks, war with Russia is something that's likely to happen in the foreseeable future, it's not impossible. And we need to start building up our industries, but also get our psychology around the fact that we may be in a very, very different world, even if it doesn't feel like that every day. And, getting back into the understanding of what nuclear deterrence means. We're getting strong in order to stay safe and to keep war away. I mean, I think there's got to be much more education, explanation by politicians about what all that's about, because it's double Dutch, I think, to many people, and for the best reason. We've had a long period of peace and security where we haven't had to think about that. But we do need to start thinking about it again now.
Yes, well, the likes of you and I and our different guises have had to think about it to stop the general public having to do it, which is great. But we talk about war, and we talk about war quite glibly. And your head of German intelligence turning around saying he expects Russia to test Article 5. He's not saying carry out a conventional attack. He hinted that, and some commentators have done it. But should we almost be in the game of redefining what war is? Because, again, a lot of commentators are effectively saying we're de facto at war with Russia today, but in the grey zone, that your level below what would elicit an immediate military response. And we're seeing that in cyber, with information, with sabotage, with espionage, with assassinations. Or is that just a recognition that all this stuff has always been going on anyway, and we just need to recognize it and step up our defenses against it?
Well, I don't think we should go around saying we're at war with Russia. Because that's not credible. And we need to keep that in reserve, for when things get really serious. But the Russians basically are at war with us. I think that's right.
Yeah.
And not in terms of sending infantry divisions towards us across the central German plain, but the sabotage attacks, the subversion, the assassinations we've seen on British soil and other places, the cyber attacks, all of that is a kind of grey area warfare, if you want to call it like that. They are hostile to us, and they are getting increasingly reckless. The severing of cables and so on. There are things we wouldn't have imagined them doing even a decade ago, which they are prepared to do and take risks doing it. So we do need to get into that mentality, yes, and it does mean a kind of resilience across the whole of society. We've talked a lot about defense spending and getting into a more defense mindset, but our grids, our power systems, our water supplies. I mean, there are whole areas of our society which are not well protected. And when the big outage happened at Heathrow, my first thought, I'm afraid, was that was a Russian sabotage attack.
Yeah.
And if it had been, it would have been pretty effective.
Yeah.
So I think thinking resilience in our societies and even in our daily lives, being prepared for what happened in Spain, when the electricity went off completely for half a day. Are we prepared in our homes for that? All these sorts of things people do need to be thinking about again, because it's no longer impossible.
So from your exalted position in the House of Lords, where you're talking to us from today, in that beautiful Palace of Westminster, on the banks of the Thames, you should be in the best position to work out where all this is going. Where's it going?
Well, if I knew that, I'd probably be living on an island somewhere. I think that we have had a real wake-up call in the last 3 years. I think if you think back to 3 years ago, the last British Defence Review was talking about an Indo-Pacific tilt, that we had grand plans to send our aircraft carriers to the Far East. That would be our sort of thrust of our defence policy. We've woken up to the fact that Europe is where our security lies. We are in a much better shape with our European neighbours as a result of Ukraine and Trump. Our relationship with France is excellent. We've got Emmanuel Macron coming on a state visit next month. So our near neighborhood relationships are far better than they were a few years ago. The relationship with the Americans, of course, is now worrying, unpredictable, unstable. But Trump isn't forever. And if the outcome is that we Europeans collectively do take our own security more responsibly, do spend more, do see ourselves as more having to look after ourselves rather than free riding on that American military budget for the next 40 years, I don't think that's a bad thing at all. So I don't think we need to be pessimistic. One last thought, Putin is not eternal. Those 1 million casualties you started the podcast with, there will be a reckoning somewhere. I mean, the Russians are humans. They, yes, they can absorb pain and sacrifice, but at some point there will be a reckoning. And, Putin will pay it either in life or, after his death in reputation. And maybe the successor to Putin won't have the same obsession about Ukraine and NATO. And maybe we can find a new way of living with Russia, which is never going to be a friend, but needn't be as hostile as it is now. So I think we should be prepared to be optimistic about our societies while being really determined to make sure that we are strong enough to survive these turbulent next few years.
Well, when a former diplomat with your experience comes out with positive statements like that, that's the time to stop. Lord Peter Ricketts, thank you very much for talking to me today on Frontline.
Thank you very much. Much enjoyed it.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like access to exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership and watch us on YouTube. But you can now get us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget, you can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs and read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.